Hello, First United Methodist Church, Winter Park. It's Craig Bloker here with our daily devotion as we seek to find hope together through this season of disruption. Now, we're starting something new this week. We're going to take a few devotions to unpack missions, what missions looks like in the church, and some guiding principles as we move forward. Going to bring Pastor David into this conversation moving forward. And so it's going to be kind of a hybrid devotional and also church updates as Pastor David has been doing. But I just wanted to start with some guiding principles to help shape where we are and where we are going as a church and as it relates to missions. Whoops, there we go. That was just the beginning of the conversation. As I mentioned, bring Pastor David into this and possibly a few other folks as well. And I just wanted to start by, if we're looking at what a church is, if we're going to boil that down to the core essence, or what are the key things that a church ought or must do for it to be a church versus just a organization or group or gathering of Christians. And I think that it's threefold. That a church must do worship. There has to be a component of turning our attention to God, to learn from Him as we gather collectively. Now, obviously, that looks a little different in this season. The second thing that a church must do for it to be a church would be discipleship. And particularly as Wesleyan Christians, we believe that discipleship can only be done in community. So we have to be in community or connected to one another as we help one another grow or spur one another on to grow into the image and likeness of Jesus Christ. The third, you can do the first two. You can worship, you can gather, you can help people grow in discipleship. But if a church is not in mission or in service to their community and around the world, then it cannot be a church. We see that Jesus' last action to the disciples is to send them out to Jerusalem, Judea, and to the ends of the earth, and ever increasing spheres of influence to make disciples of Jesus Christ, right? So that the church has to be in mission. It has to seek to meet the needs in the community, right? We see in Matthew 25, where Jesus is separating the sheep and the goats and saying to those on the sheep, those that will be welcomed into glory, you saw me, I was hungry and you fed me, I was naked and you clothed me, I was without a place to sleep and you invited me in. We see this holy hospitality and service to others as a key marker. James, the book of James, is crystal clear on this, that faith without works is dead, that we have to be in service. And then we see throughout Scripture kind of protected or extra special groups of people that are key to God, that God shows compassion and love to all, but there's a little extra compassion and love for orphans and widows, for the poor and for immigrants. Those are the four key categories that are lifted up throughout Old and New Testaments. So if we were to look at the church at the minimum viable product for a church to be a church, it would be worship, discipleship, and that we must be in mission. So it is crucial as we move forward that we be a church that is in mission. Now, I wanted to share some of When Helping Hurts. It's the most helpful resource that I have found to help shape us or inform us as Christians how we ought to do missions as best as we possibly can. It gives us a theological framework for who God is and how God works in the world. Now there's a online training. Well, from a book initially, and then there's an online training, kind of 6-video session, be done in person or online, that we will be using as we go forward, kind of training ourselves. And I know some folks at the church and some who may be watching or listening have gone through this as well. But I just want to give kind of a high level 35,000 foot view of what some of the guiding principles are so that we all may grow in understanding of missions. Now, I wanted to begin this time just sharing some of my own personal story. Missions have always been um, of great import to me in my walk with God, and is connected to my call story. And I was a finance major in undergrad. Um, didn't feel called to ministry in the slightest. Now, the summer before my senior year of college, in the midst of the financial crisis, um, I served as a youth intern with the church that I grew up at, and we took a missions trip to Philadelphia with a group, the Center for Student Missions, or CSM. Now, when I felt a clear call from ministry the last semester of college before graduating, and I'm like, I don't know where to go from this, I ended up applying to be a host with the same organization that I had gone on a missions trip with earlier, or the previous summer. And so I ended up as a host with CSM in Washington, D.C. And in it, I experienced, we would take middle and high school student youth groups all around to different serving opportunities, homeless shelters, soup kitchens, all sorts of different serving, just to get outside of the bubble that many of the those that would come on mission trips grew up in, as well as to see kind of the issues that we have in our urban cities. One example, or two places that we would go that were breakfast feeding places. One, and I won't use the name because they do great work, but it's one of the largest places for feeding programs that I've ever seen in any city. The former President Obama went and served there, and they had that picture proudly displayed on the wall. And they serve hundreds and hundreds of people every single day, breakfast and lunch. And they have a number of people, largely from churches, that come in, prepare, and serve the food. Then there's another place. It's called Charlie's Place. It's at a small Episcopal church, Northwest DC, not too far from the White House, actually right across from the Hilton that President Reagan was shot outside of. And in it, Paul Jones, who ran the program, would welcome those homeless folks into the basement of this Episcopal church to feed. And I remember one morning seeing someone who I'd seen at this other feeding program, this successful feeding program that had, frankly, significantly better food, was a much clearer, cleaner, efficient process. Then I saw him at Charlie's Place, and had a conversation with him, and he noted that he appreciated coming to Charlie's Place more. And it struck me, I mean, the food was frankly markedly worse. There wasn't kind of the clear efficiency. And if you're going for a feeding program, you would think food, positive food, access to other resources would be the best. But he said he appreciated going to Charlie's Place because when he went to this other feeding program, he felt like cattle being herded through a line and then directed to sit in a specific seat to eat quickly, to get up so that they could reset the room to welcome in new people. And he said he appreciated going to Charlie's Place because it was personal. I remember seeing Paul work. He knew the name of everyone who came in. He knew their story, what was going on in their lives. Now, this would be far less efficient for serving food, but far more powerful, at least for this person. Found it interesting that every person who came in, they had a job to do. It wasn't just you came, you ate, and you left. That you had a job in cleaning or welcoming others, serving, that everyone had a job to do. That there was a clear community of this was work done with one another rather than for one another. And that always stuck out to me. And I think really displays kind of innately, I felt that there was something right about this. And that When Helping Hurts really gives a framework. And I think that's why it resonated so deeply with me. Now, from the first of these 6 training videos, they begin the training by offering that we have to have a proper diagnosis of the problem. Because if we diagnose the problem incorrectly, then however we would go to treat the problem would be based off of our incorrect diagnosis. They really begin by challenging our assumptions of what poverty is. So in this When Helping Hurts training, they note that middle and upper class folks, the materially non-poor, often define poverty in material terms: a lack of housing, a lack of food, a lack of financial income. And so when we define poverty in material terms, our solutions tend to be material solutions: providing food, providing shelter. And what they argue, and I think is an important guiding principle for us, as they argue in When Helping Hurts, is that poverty is really broken relationships with God, broken relationships with self, broken relationships with one another and the community that we find ourselves in. And that by just providing material things, you don't help empower or lead to development in those that are seeking, and you resign them to the place of recipient. So if we go back to the 2 feeding programs, Charlie's Place, everyone would sit together and eat. At this other feeding program that I'd mentioned, volunteers would come in and would serve across the counter. That they would go and they would wipe down the tables between, but there was not any connection. It was a very unidirectional serving. And so for proper growth, it has to be relational. If we see poverty as a lack of relationships or broken relationships, then the solution must be relational. And in this first video, they interview people that would be materially poor from around the United States and around the world. And they asked people who were materially poor to define what poverty was for them. And they didn't use material terms. They used psychological or social terms, that it's a feeling of hopelessness, stuck in a cycle, or feeling, of inferiority, that I have nothing to offer. And so if we want to have better outcomes as followers of Christ, we have to define poverty not just in material terms, but in terms of broken relationship. Now, one of the other kind of key leaders in this, so we have When Helping Hurts, one of the other kind of primary tomes in Christian service over the last couple decades would be Toxic Charity by Robert Lupton, who works out of Atlanta. And in one of his books, he says even more sobering, and this is him evaluating. Now, he was from an affluent suburb of Atlanta, and his church would come in and do work in the inner city, and reflecting on the outcomes of that work, is he said this. He said, even more sobering, I condemn those I help to the permanent role of recipient. Now, that's what happens when we have the wrong diagnosis. If we diagnose poverty as merely a lack of material things, then we condemn those we seek to help, we hope to serve, into the permanent role of recipient. And I think it's an important note for us, and it's something that we've tried to incorporate as the work with Foundries. We help these young adults who've aged out of the foster care system, that whether it's to our mentees or to our mentors, we've shared that every person involved, whether it's a mentee or a mentor, whichever side of the table you're sitting on, has something to offer unique to this world that no one else can offer. It's what I love about the work that Inua does. Now, as they went through their name changing, Inua in Swahili means to lift up, and has a corporate or communal kind of meaning to that it means to lift up together. I love even their kind of byline, right? It's Inua Partners in Hope. And I know that they were very intentional in that name, that it's not that we are coming to fix problems, but rather that we are in a partnership and we have as much to learn as we have to offer. So I just want to start there as some of our initial guiding principles, that as a church, missions is key for a church to be what God has called us to be, that we would define poverty in relational rather than material terms, and that we would seek to become partners in hope in our city, in our state, in our country, and around the world. So I hope this gives a little framework, and we'll be back later this week with some more work in this area. You are loved. Go in peace. Have a blessed week, and catch you next week.